This says we have 45 minutes left of the entire con. That's crazy. So I guess we should get started. Well, so yeah, good day everyone, and welcome to our session. Look cute, might delete later. In this session, we're going to talk all about content revisions in Drupal. So I do want to thank everyone for choosing to spend the last session with us. That means a lot in this final session at DrupalCon Global 2020. So before we get started, I don't know, show of hands, who wants to hear a terrible joke? Tough. I won't say one anyway. So the other day I was editing a blog post, right? All of a sudden I deleted an entire sentence. I tried Command Z, I tried to recover the document, you name it. But eventually I just gave it up as a lost clause. So luckily, if you're using revisions properly, maybe you won't have that same problem next time. So shall we begin?
Hello, my name is Caroline. I'm a developer here at Phase 2.
Hi, I'm Toby Hagler. I'm a Director of Engineering here at Phase 2.
So yeah, as we run through this, of course, if you have any questions, you know, there was a suggestion prefix to it because we'll try to scroll those and answer those. We love seeing your questions and hearing the conversations. So what we're going to cover is kind of three stages here. We'll start with just taking a look at how revisions work. This is something that I have seen. I think that probably most of us have seen kind of trip people up. I have personally watched this break developers' brains on more than one occasion, so we'll take a minute to take a look at that.
Yeah, also, after that, we're going to walk through a couple of common use cases dealing with paragraphs, multilingual content, content moderation and workflow, and how those things take advantage of revisions.
And at the very end, we'll take just a quick moment to acknowledge a couple of the most commonly used modules and what they do.
Real quick, I want to address a question from the chat already. Brian, you asked the slides URL. I will actually, when this is over, I'm going to post the PDF in the session info page, and I will look to see if I can get a URL for this almost immediately after.
All right. So with that, let's get started with kind of the basics. I know for some people this is probably going to be heavy recap, although I hope to surprise you in a few places. This is worth spending a little bit of time before getting to the so what, because revisions is one of those things that, like I said, fairly regularly seems to kind of break people's brains a little bit. First of all, I think part of the problem is that they don't quite work the way that we think they do. Because of words like revert and make current, I think we're often lulled into a false sense of complexity, actually. The truth of the matter is that revisions just isn't that complicated. As you'll see, it uses a couple of very simple tools, but in really interesting and powerful ways. So our mental model tends to be a little bit more like Git, when in reality, this is a lot more like final, use me, no, seriously, this one, April latest. It's a lot more like a Xerox machine. So it is useful to know, I think, that all revisions do have some properties regardless of the parent entity. So lots of different types of entities. So that could be media or nodes are revisionable in Drupal 8. The big ones, the big aspects of this are published or unpublished, the sort of visibility state. This is actually not content. This is not content moderation or workflow, but obviously those two modules use very heavy use of it. Unsurprisingly, it has an ID and a relationship to an entity there. And some revisions are also kind of special. They can be marked current or latest. As we'll see, those are important. And if content moderation is enabled, they can have a content moderation state, for example, draft. So the easiest thing here, I think, is to actually look at some revisions and what happens if we mess with them. So here we have a pristine list of real revisions. And as you can see, the page has a little bit of history. We can kind of imagine how this was created thanks to this editor so wisely entering log messages. Now it's worth noting that a lot of modules actually can interact with the screen and make it look a little bit different. I've stuck with stock core here, so your site actually might look a little bit different. Importantly, content moderation is enabled for this screen here and for this node, and as we'll see in a minute, it's pretty vital to making the most of revisions. Okay, this here, the one in yellow, or that, again, your theme might make it look a little different, is the current revision, also known as the default revision. It's one of those two important types. This one is latest revision, which, like it says on the tin, is the most recent. This is what you would always see when you hit node edit, for instance, or media edit if it's media.
So between these two types of revision, sort of like a modifier on a normal revision, right? We have all of the actual revisions behavior that we need on the active ones. So unless you're reverting to an old revision, most of the time you're going to be dealing with a revision that meets at least one of these criteria. So given that, let's see some examples of how content moderation, for instance, interacts with revisions. So content moderation, which is a part of core now, exposes a lot more information about the revisions themselves and gives you a better sense of the anatomy of your content's history and current status. And a question that was raised in the chat a moment ago, somebody asked, does somebody actually use revision log messages? The response to that is, if you love your fellow copy editors, you will.
Or, as someone pointed out, if you make it required and you force them to. I'm curious how many of them are just malicious compliance periods, but yeah, it's hugely helpful. That screen, if I go back, with no log messages is just sad dates that mean nothing to anyone. So yes, please try to talk people into it or require it.
Or require it. But because the revisions in the draft state can't be made current, this allows us to kind of split current and latest revisions. So suddenly they become two different things. So you can have them be separate. So remember, without content moderation, these terms become, they are unfortunately synonymous. So let's look quickly at another state. So now with the archive state, we've defined that this is an unpublished state, just like draft is, but it's going to be the current revision when applicable. So, another newer revision that can be, also be current, would win. So this makes the archive state of an effective piece of content, it basically makes it the off button, even though that is the latest state of it.
Okay, so before we wrap up talking about how revisions work and finally getting into the okay, but why do we care portion of this talk, let's take a look at a few of the most common operations to sort of finalize our mental model here. And what better way to get our mental model in order than doing some quick experiments with screenshots. I'm sorry, we would have really cute little handheld magnifying glasses if we could. All right, so our natural is we sort of look at this fictitious story here of our edits and revision history here. The next logical step is to publish from a draft. So before I show you what happens when we do that, the point of this exercise is I want you to envision what you think the screen will look like when we do that. So we're going to take more working on things, we're making progress, and we're going to say, yep, good enough, ship it, and we're going to publish it. So what should the screen look like? Ta-da! If you thought that, you're right. So now we can see this is a state where our previous screenshots showed latest revision and current revision being actually separate revisions. In this case, it's the same one. That's because the published state is a valid state for current, and it happens to be latest. Okay. Now this is the tricky one. This is the money shot. What will happen if we revert that felt cute might delete later? How many of you think that the yellow bar goes back to felt cute might delete later? How many think that other revisions are going to move or something else is going to happen? I want you to think about, what do you think is going to happen to the screen? We're going to revert. Again, this one here, felt cute, might delete later. Ah! Remember when I said revisions are kind of dumb and not that complicated? So all that it did, it didn't actually revert the way our brains want to think about it. All it did is clone the revision we picked, put it at the top of the pile. Simple, but effective. Okay, again, really fast. What happens if I make a draft from the publish? So the reverse of what we did at the beginning. Thinking. You guessed that, that's right. So again, we now have that forward revision state where we have our current revision, but ahead of that is our latest, which is our draft. So again, and remember that draft is of the thing that I reverted. So there's no tree here, there's no branch, there's no cleverness. It's just stack, 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 final, latest, use me. But wait, what if I didn't want to draft? What if I wanted to actually unpublish that page? I hit unpublish because I didn't want anyone to see it anymore. Well, in content moderation terms, that's the archive state, which is, as we can see, well, you couldn't see from here, but it's unpublished and it's also current. So in a way, it works exactly like publish operation, except this time people can't see it. So our kind of off button. All right, so what did our screenshot science teach us about revisions? First of all, it's always additive, unless you're deleting them. But any operation that you do, it's always just adding another one and it's adding it to the top of the pile. You can never truly go backwards. There's a lot of words that sound like we get to do that, but that's actually not how revisions work. And using just published and unpublished, plus which revision is the current one, we actually can control visibility and access quite effectively. So there we go. That's how revisions work, more or less, out of the box with content moderation.
Yeah, and just to follow up, we did have a question in the chat. So you're not changing your location in the queue, you're copying and placing the old back on the top.
Right. So
yeah, just to clarify.
Go back to the one with the arrow. There we go. So yeah, I had actually hit that button revert where the blue dot is. I had literally clicked that button, and that's what it does. And it just makes a copy.
Yeah. Okay, so with having a better understanding now about how revisions work overall, let's take a quick look at what happens when some common tools take advantage of revisions and do some tricky things. So we're going to look at things like multilingual content, content moderation and editorial workflows, and my favorite one, nested revisionable entities. It's going to get fun now. We're going to do math. All right, so start off simple, multilingual content, right? Like, yeah, to call multilingual content in Drupal simple is, this is the simplest one. Okay, so when dealing with multilingual content, there's a couple of things you need to be able to enable. If you're not familiar with multilingual recently, enabling things like the language module, the content translation modules. So the content translation module basically allows you to create a translation of a node where each individual field on that node is translated on its own. You effectively have a copy of the node, even though it's considered the same node with a different language code. So translation is just essentially a code of that original node, and then a language code that keeps the field values separated. There's a lot of other things you can do, but at its core, that's the simple version of content translation. So to translate content, all you have to do when you're editing a node is simply click the Translate tab, just like you were going to go to edit it. So every translation of a node has its own collection of revisions that are unique to that language. Editing the content of one language creates new revisions for all of the fields of that language, but not any of the other translations of the same node. So here's a quick example of what that looks like. So here you see a typical translation of a single node in English y en español. Now, none of the translations are yet published, but you can publish each translation independently, which, by the way, would create a new revision for that single translation. So they don't cross the streams here. So in this next slide, we've got some English content that's gone through a couple of draft states, each creating a new revision from the previous version. And you can see from those lovely, delightful log messages, they are very specific to the English content only. So finally, somebody with the publish transition permission, which we'll talk about transitions here in a minute, publishes the node, didn't make any content changes, but that does create yet another revision. And similarly, the Spanish translation for this exact same node, it's the same node ID, same path, same everything else. Oh, path is going to be different because it's going to have a language prefix, but otherwise the same. So there's some edits along the way. There's some translations, but otherwise these translations are kept in a draft state. And so finally, because, and I say we're using a draft state because we're also using content moderation on top of everything else. That helps us visualize what's going on. But finally, the current revision was created with the Spanish translation of this node. It gets published. And so even though, again, in that yellow field, even though no content fields were changed, the transition was published, and therefore that is a new revision. Okay, which leads us back to content moderation. And I'm going to talk briefly about some of the different states and transitions and how all of that makes use of revisions. So just to recap a couple of things, without revisions or content moderation in Drupal core, you just have two default states, period. You have published and unpublished. It's a binary value on the node. It's a 1 or a 0. You're either published or you're not. That's it. With content moderation, this introduces a couple of other states. You're either published still, or you're not, but you have any variation of non-published states. So these are a little bit more useful in complex editorial workflows. You can indicate how complete a piece of content is. You can create custom states for your workflow. If you don't like the ones that are out of the box, you can create your own, depending on how complex you want to make your workflow. So you have states, and then you have transitions, and the transitions are the action of changing from one state to another. And you define these from every possible combination you want to go from states. So you can go from draft to published, from published to archived, but you may never go from draft to archived directly because there's really no point. So it's important to note that the act of pushing a piece of content through one of these transitions will create a new revision every time. And then when you have things like workflows, you can create a different workflow for different content types. These are just collections of states and transitions. So that's what we mean by a workflow in this context. So that is one thing that's cool about it. You can apply different workflows to different content types. Okay. Let's see. I go too far. Okay, I think I'm lost in my notes. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, I'm back, folks. So, sorry, my screen is very tiny. So here's a really common scenario, right? So you've got two roles, let's say. So you have a copywriter who can add and edit content, but can only save nodes in a draft state. Then you have a publisher who has additional permissions, such as using the publish transition. So a copywriter creates a new node, fills in some content, maybe makes some edits along the way. But really, all they can do is save these as drafts, right? So every time a copywriter creates a new edit, though, it is creating a new revision for that piece of content, regardless of being able to move that to any other state. And then the publisher comes along and publishes the node, which is yet another revision. If that copywriter then creates a new draft from the published version, let's say they found a typo, which is not uncommon, if I'm the one typing, for instance, they can create a new draft. But since content moderation doesn't allow them to publish their draft, this creates the latest revision, which is not the current revision. And so, like Caroline mentioned earlier, there is that sort of split sometimes between latest revision and the current revision. So these are prime examples of how those sorts of things can happen. So if you have, in this workflow example, in this piece of published content, you'll notice this is a rough draft. Now my draft is complete. Thanks for the feedback. This is even better than the first draft. And then if you transition to the next version of this, it mentions the typo is fixed. So this is where you have the ability to edit content and then click on the latest version tab to see the moderation state. You have the transition to go to published. And of course, because you love your fellow copy editors, you're going to make a log message to explain what happened. And voila, so now the version with the corrected typo is the current revision, and all is right with the world again. You'll notice that previous transition button is no longer there. So transitioning content from one state to another always creates a new revision. Got it. Okay, so this happens whether you modify content or not. Got it. So however, if you do both, you change some content around and you transition from draft to published state, that's still just one revision in total. So if you revert back to the previous revision, which really just makes an exact copy of that previous revision and places it on top, then what you've done is reverted that content change and effectively transitioned the public state back to draft all in one go. So be aware of that being a possibility. Okay. So this is where it's going to get fun or messy. Pick one. So the paragraphs module uses the entity reference revisions module to do some really crazy sort of voodoo magic here with the revisions. It does some really smart things, but it does some stuff behind the scenes that you sometimes don't expect. So basically, you define a paragraph type, which has a collection of fields. Then you have the content of that paragraph as you're editing the node. The entity reference revisions module is what makes that custom paragraphs entity, well, revisionable, right? So then when you save a node with paragraphs, you wind up saving revisions of all of the fields within the paragraph, a revision of the paragraph field itself, and all of the other things associated with the node. So, which when paragraphs gets out of control and gets into your shared screen supply, you get I think you're muted, Caroline.
So I was just saying, there are some of you who probably came to this talk specifically hoping we would make fun of paragraphs. Here you go. But let's actually walk through for a minute, because I think you cannot talk with Drupal developers or Drupal people and mention revisions without the topic of paragraphs coming up. And it's worth taking a moment to really dig into why that is and how we get into, problems with performance and whatnot. Let's do more triple science. Let's pretend that we have a node and it has 3 paragraph fields on it. From what we know about what we just looked at, what happens when one revision references another revision and then a new revision is made. So you made an edit to the page and you hit save. Both get a new revision. And then if those also have other things that they reference that also have revisions, remember this is on the save operation, same save operation. So you just hit save once, you still are getting more revisions. And then what happens if we translate the original node and make a new one with all of those? Yeah, it gets out of hand very quickly. So let's take a look at some actual numbers here.
So for those rare Klingons among us who don't like tribbles, let's talk numbers. So let's take a really simple content type, which happens to be, and then this will let you see what happens to the core database underneath everything. So every time you save the node, in this particular example, we're creating 3 separate database table entries for the node revision table itself, for the title field on that node, and 1 for the body, right? Not too bad, three tables. It's pretty well indexed and so on. So, but let's add a paragraph field to that content type. All right, so a node revision table, title, body, got it. The paragraph is just another field, so that's just one more revision table entry. Oh, and then each field within the paragraph type. Okay, so in my paragraph is really simple. It's only got 3 additional fields of its own. However, because I'm kind of a glutton for punishment, apparently, I allow a cardinality of up to 10 instances of that paragraph type on my content type. So in total, that's a possible 44 revision table entries added to the database in this one save operation. So Drupal's databases, it's the structure is highly normalized, so storing that data is not a big deal, but the query to sift through all of those field revision tables gets pretty gnarly really fast. So let's say you've saved this one node 10 times, and you've now entered 440 revision records across 44 database tables that then have to get selected. So what happens when you use nested paragraphs? We saw that in the triple lineage. What can happen? So let's consider a paragraph that contains just 3 paragraph fields. You can do some really common 3-column layout for a page, right? So let's say we've got that carousel paragraph with 3 fields on it. The cardinality set to 10. Maybe a block quote paragraph that just has a couple of extra fields. Maybe a teaser block that maybe cycles through as many as 3 different teaser values, which that's just one field, right? It's just an entity reference field. So not bad. We're only up to 51 revision fields that get added to the database every time this one node is saved. So because I like doing math, 5,000 nodes of content. Let's say you've got a website with only 5,000 nodes of content with 10 fields on each node, but they also contain up to 5 paragraphs, which might have an average of about 6 fields each. So that's 46 field and entity revisions that are created every time a node is edited. This could lead up to well over 200,000 database fields for just 5,000 pieces of content. And that's just when we're dealing with nodes. So 230,000 field revisions, and that's just from one potential node save for each one of those nodes, right? That's if we've saved each of your 5,000 nodes once. So fun fact, you can edit each one of those nodes 10 times. Let's say you have a lot of working drafts and a really strict editorial workflow process. We've got 2.3 million revision entries across several dozen database tables, all because we like to do some crazy stuff with nested paragraphs and all that other fun stuff. So now you can kind of see why a lot of people like to make a little bit of noise about paragraphs and performance, and yeah, why is my site slow? Now, to be fair, revision tables are very well indexed, and most of the revision data is very highly cacheable. So there's a lot of mitigation. However, revisions. Yeah.
So we really just wanted to use that slide, to be honest with you. But I mean, so there's a lot of awesome discussion that's blowing up in the comments, which is wow. I think it's worth noting, as people have noted in the comment section, there are decisions to be made here, right? There is no silver bullet. Revisions are not inherently evil. They have a job to do, and they do that job pretty well. But there are potentially things where, if we're not conscious, we're not paying attention, and not thinking about how we are constructing our sites, we could potentially end up in a situation we don't want to be in. So this is very much a right tool for right job thing. Using lots of paragraph nesting is probably rarely a right tool. partially for this reason. Okay, so as the clock counts down on the end of DrupalCon, and before we bid you all farewell, I do want to leave some time for conversation and discussion at the end here. We did promise that we would just very quickly give a quick overview of some of the most common modules and what they do. So there are a ton of modules involved in editorial process and workflow, like a ton of modules involved in editorial process and workflow, way bigger, like a whole talk in itself if we wanted to cover all of that, which is, I'm sure shocking for a content management system. That said, the ones that you are very, very likely to run into in the wild on a large number of sites are probably these. We've talked extensively about the first two. Content moderation, again, it's worth noting that you are by no means stuck with default out-of-the-box moderation states. I think some people posted some of their states and transitions in the chat. Critically, I want to mention this one for developers here. Content moderation has some very nice services you can use to interact with revisions. Get current revision is not actually something that core does without content moderation well at all. So if you're looking for utilities for managing revisions, go check out that module. It's got some good stuff and some utility services. That coupled with workflow, and you get a lot of power. There's a lot that just these two modules allow us to do, especially if you get into tailoring them and matching with your content types. So crucially, these transitions are permissioned individually, which gives you a ton of control over who can do what. So super, super powerful, even if it's not actually all that complex. I want to talk about Workbench quickly because it comes up a lot. Workbench used to contain a lot of the power of those two modules. Folks who are very familiar with 7 often, think of Workbench when we think of these types of things. I've heard, hey, if I use Workbench or I use content moderation, I shouldn't use Workbench, right? Actually, not true. So you definitely don't need Workbench. What Workbench does today is all about dashboarding and basically making all of that content much more digestible for editors, helping you keep track of where your content is, what state it's in, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all driven by views, so it's really, really easy to customize. It still has value. I'd recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it in a while, since maybe 7.
Well, let's see.
So I think Toby's on. Sounds like there was a question in the chat. My window has that blocked a little bit. Lastly, I just want to mention the diff module is used a lot, and in the context of revision specifically, it's really helpful. Again, we talked about revision log messages. When they're there, they're super helpful. But without those, that revision screen is much harder to use. Obviously, leaving messages is a good practice, but diff gives you more tools to work with when that isn't an option. And it also does a couple of other little nice things like showing the revision state of revisions, which is not in there by default with content moderation. So some nice little utilities there as well. So quick recap and then question time. What we have learned today: revisions are born pregnant.
Yeah, so things that we've learned today. So the core state is very simple. You get only published or unpublished. Then with revisions, you can make simple copies of the previous version. That's really all a revision does. The content moderation module adds a lot of power to the listing of revisions and provides a lot of flexibility and insight. Workflow adds a lot of additional states and transitions to make the lives easier to manage where content lives in that sort of chain of revisions and where it should be. Multilingual revisions happen per language, which is a very nice, clean way to manage anything like that. And then Workbench adds a lot of visibility into some of the content states, where things live, where they are in the process of your organization's workflow. So with that, we have enough time for questions, which I'm delighted about. So yeah, let's jump into that. I will actually thank you all for listening, and I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. And let's start questions. Okay, I will do some scrolling.
if you don't mind fielding, Toby. All right. Let's see. Did we miss? Saw Q. Paragraph store its content in configuration to aid revisioning. Here's an interesting thought. So basically storing it as flat YAML as a way, is that what you're sort of discussing here? Yeah, I don't know. I think not without, ultimately I think it's a kind of hypothetical re-architecting paragraphs is something that kind of comes up every once in a while and hasn't been done for a reason because it would be an enormous undertaking.
There is also a lot of conversation happening in the Drupal 9 issue queue. There's a core issue addressing the concept of don't create a revision for fields that have not changed. So being aware of, hey, did this change or not? Which gets a little bit dicey. It's been a conversation going on for a couple of years. One of the things that has prevented it from getting along further is, how do you know if you have revisions 1, 2, 3, 4, this field is changed somewhere in here? When was the last time that field was actually changed when you go to revert to a previous one? So it's a very tricky problem. And hopefully people smarter than me are still thinking about it. But it's very similar to the concept of how Git works, where it wants to store a diff between each revision. There's some talk about handling it that way, but
yeah. And just to clarify Andre's question, thinking a little bit more like the layout builder serialized approach to storing data, which I will mention has its own foibles. I can tell you the migration people I work with really love that format. They would much prefer to migrate things into paragraphs. I heard a lot about modules that delete useless revisions. Any suggestions for that?
I don't have any suggestions offhand. I know that similarly, when developers are writing content migration, they'll oftentimes look for either, let's say, the past 5 revisions for a given field, or any revision that, say, like before a certain timeline or watermark. So that's one way you can handle that. But I don't have any modules offhand. Maybe somebody in the crowd does, that actually does cleanup of very old revisions.
But yeah, I mean, I think I haven't had any personal experience with it, but manually doing that, or programmatically doing that, and to custom meet business logic is definitely something I've seen.
The beauty of crowdsourcing. Rolando just posted a link in here: Drupal.org/project/node revisions auto clean. So thank you for that.
Perfect.
And Lucas.
Yeah, definitely something to look into and consider, I think, because yeah, that's definitely one way to deal with it. Is just not have access to as many revisions. How do we fix this? Paragraph pregnancy. I think it's the best thing. The easiest way to dramatically reduce that crazy exponential growth is to limit nesting as much as possible. Like, period, end of story. So I think to that end, where we see a lot of that nesting is in things that are really layout. So, reaching for other tools. Yes, layout builder is something that comes up a lot. It's very good at that. But, trying to avoid using nested paragraphs as a means of controlling layout, I think solves a lot of the problems that we see with those really crazy bloated databases. This is a good one. Are revisions added to paragraphs when paragraph fields are excluded from the node form display?
Good question.
I don't know.
I think it's going to be not when. That's actually a really good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I want to test it now. I want to go find out, because I would guess that it probably does. I mean, I think for the display there is probably not, for lack of a better description, low level enough to impact what revisions thinks it needs to create, for lack of a better, just to totally anthropomorphize that.
Yeah, I would imagine that. I mean, form display is not something you see messed with a lot, to be honest. And it's got some pretty powerful tools. I would think that the node definition, which has a list of all of the fields, would probably supersede what is in the form display. So it's very likely, my guess, my uneducated, untested guess would be that it would still create field revisions for those fields that exist on the content type, despite not being present in the form itself.
Yeah. Next is, do you foresee the generic revision UI problem being solved anytime soon? So basically that revision screen that we took screenshots of, which is, yeah, without log messages, there's not a lot there. And it's been something that's been an active discussion for a long time, 6 years. I don't know, I'm not up on the most current discussion around that. I know that there were conversations of pretty dramatically changing how revisions work to the point of it actually being more like Git, more like truly branched types of logic, which would be huge. I'm actually kind of surprised that there isn't a go-to contrib for this, because it's all queryable. It feels like something that maybe we should all get up and do something about that and make an alternate revision screen, because it's there's not a lot of magic to that. If you look at the controller for that, it's not doing a whole lot. Not so much that we couldn't write something new. Have you ever encountered the revision page showing revisions from other translations, or the current version indicator only showing on the last saved translation revision? I have not personally run into that.
Yeah, that one I don't know.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of great conversation here.
There is an interesting comment I did want to point out. The auto clean approach only works when you don't have retention policies. Laura Gates mentioned that. That's very true. If you have, especially governmental or other regulatory things that require you to retain all of your policies, or all of your previous revisions, those policies would definitely not allow you to use some of the auto clean.
Yeah, or you'd have to be very careful of how you applied such a thing, because it might not be all your content, right? But yeah. Yeah, and some again discussion around merging duplicates might solve a lot of this as well. If again, that idea of if there's no data difference here, we don't need to clutter the database with it. Let's just keep referencing the same thing. And I did want to briefly mention, I feel like I saw some questions sort of related to this. It's worth noting that entity reference revisions and entity references are actually quite different. An entity references, so if you reference media 123, it's always going to pull the current revision of media 123. If you go back to a 6-month-old revision, it's not going to pull the 6-month-old version of media 123 at the time you created that revision. With paragraphs, since it's very intrinsic to the content, it's actually very important it does that, right? Reverting your page to an older version, but showing today's version of the paragraph data doesn't help you at all. You might as well not have had revisions at all. Like, why I bothered? So, yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. We have 1 minute left.
Yeah.
There's a survey. Please, if you liked this or you hated it, please take the survey. It helps the great folks at the Drupal Association make excellent content. Thank you all for the fantastic chat. I regret presenting such that I couldn't chime in with you. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, and take care.
thank everyone for making DrupalCon great. Even though we couldn't be there in person, it was still great.
Take care. We just have to leave.
Yeah.
We're leaving. Goodbye.
Live long and prosper.